leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the hunting games like a woo-wee. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. Gotta do that one again. Tick, tick. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus be breathing mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, y'all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a snake mind hoax. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. Esophagus be breathing mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, y'all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a snake mind hoax. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. Be breathing mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, y'all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a snake mind hoax. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. That smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the hunting games like a woo-wee. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus be breathing mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, y'all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a snake mine hope. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. This is more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. Niggas will be at your throat. It's more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. Don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. It's more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. Anti-hope, black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a snake mine hopes. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas will be at your throat. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the hunting games like a woo-wee. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the hunting games like a woo-wee. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the hunting games like a woo-wee. Two-piece dropping dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo-wee. Mother bless the her in games like a woo-wee. Happens when your shoes sink. You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo-wee. Huh. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Huh. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back at the last beat on loose leaf. We dig that, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Huh. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back at that like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Huh. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back at that like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo-wee. Huh. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back at that like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus, we breathe the mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white, the question, race face, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a slave mind hope. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save us souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus, we breathe the mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white, the question, race face, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is a slave mind hope. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save us souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. But you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You bet to pray, mother bless her in games like a woo-wee. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. Gotta do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. Gotta do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han B, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hun be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck duck, loose scenes. I do that one again. Two piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hun be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the lands, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the layers, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck duck, loose scenes. I do that one again. Two piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hun be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the layers, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. The news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the layers, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. They say I'm tripping. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the layers, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Han be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. Waste niggas with the bars, what did you drink? Y'all been treading on the layers, but what happens when your shoes sink? You better pray, mother bless the her in games like a woo. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck duck, loose scenes. I do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hun be no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars, what they do drink. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus be breathing mist, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, all illiteracy from anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is slave mine hopes. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. Kick back a thought like Hunby, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars with the juice drink. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Poopies dropping jewels like I loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hunby, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars with their juice drink. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Money pumping, mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Poopies dropping jewels like I loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hunby, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars with their juice drink. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. No Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars with it. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. I do that one again. Poopies dropping jewels like I loose leaf. We kick back a thought like Hunby, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the news feed. We waste niggas with the bars with their juice drink. Tick, tick. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throats. Esophagus, we breathe and miss, I call it cloud like quote. Sarcophagus is full of treasure with no deadline quote. And I quote, all illiteracy's an anti-hope. Black and white to question gray space, I'm anti-pope. And I know those religions is the snake mind hopes. I hear the blood of many people's crying, save our souls. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. These smoke, but you don't want that smoke. This is more than cold cuts, niggas who be at your throat. They say I'm tripping, but you the one with the loose strings. Funny puppet mother lovers playing duck, duck, goose scenes. Gotta do that one again. Two-piece dropping jewels like a loose leaf. We kick back, I thought like Hanbi, no Bruce Lee. We dig that, we battle strong, see the loose feed. We waste niggas with the bars, with their juice drink.
Somewhere
A lot of people think working in the creative and production industry is like...
Make the logo bigger.
When in reality, it's more like...
highly competitive, insane pressure.
and lots of meetings.
So what's it like running production at Versus?
Last in modern times to ship millions of Africans out of the continent as slaves. The Arab history of anti-black racism predates European anti-black racism by several centuries. The early Islamic Empire exhibited all the characteristics of anti-black racism, and blacks suffered the lowest form of bondage. Europeans took photographs of chained black African slaves in Arab slave trading vessels on the east coast of Africa in the 1880s. Slavery persisted openly in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries in the latter half of the 20th century, 100 years after slavery was abolished in the United States. As late as the 1960s, African Muslims still sold slaves when they arrived on pilgrimages, as a way to finance their pilgrimages. Arab nations lagged far behind the rest of the world in abolishing slavery. Saudi Arabia and Yemen in 1962, United Arab Emirates in 1963, Oman in 1970. However, unlike the rest of the Arab nations, hereditary racial slavery persists in Mauritania, despite multiple official attempts to abolish it. In 1981, by presidential decree, Mauritania became the last country in the world to abolish slavery, but no criminal laws were passed to enforce the ban. Under international pressure in 2007, the Mauritanian government passed a law allowing slaveholders to be persecuted. However, that law has rarely been enforced. Far more anti-slavery human rights activists have been prosecuted than the handful of Mauritanian white masters. In addition, slavers are offered compensation for freeing the enslaved, while the victims of the brutality are offered nothing. In 2015, Under international and some domestic mobilization pressure, the Mauritanian government created 3 special courts to prosecute slavery, but so far they have only tried very few cases. However, that's just not all about this oddly unique sect of slavers. The Arab slavers, at some point in history, driven outrageously by their odd ambition for economic power and human control, had their African male captives subjected to unimaginable suffering and exploitation. Castration. Yes, you heard correctly. Now, it is of utmost importance to note that what you are about to hear might seem like comparing which, between 2 evils, is better. It does not detract from the fact that the trade in human beings was unspeakably hideous. In the Americas, slaves were allowed to marry, though their children could be sold off like puppies right before their eyes. But what happened to the blacks enslaved by the Arabs? Arabs castrated African slaves. Thus, they could not reproduce their kinds to multiply and replenish the earth. Welcome to yet another video segment. In this video, we are taking a dive at one of the darkest chapters in the human history, marked by its profound brutality and stomach-twisting inhumanity, the Arab slave trade and the castration of their male captives during this dark era. Before we get right into this head-spinning narrative, don't forget to like this video as a way of acknowledging our efforts, share with family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Your support means a lot to us. The castration of male captives during the Arab slave trade would be a forever-lasting, devastating experience for the individuals who were subjected to this depraved, inhuman practice and their families. In his book, Slaves and Slavery, published in 1998, the British writer Duncan Clark defines slavery as the reduction of fellow human beings to the legal status of chattels, allowing them to be bought and sold as goods. This, in essence, is what both the Arabs and Europeans did to Africans, to justify the shipping of millions of Africans as slaves to faraway lands in Asia, in particular the Middle East, and the Americas. The African slave trade, surely one of the most tragic and disturbing episodes in the history of mankind, Clark uncovers in his book, had its origins in the intervention of forces from the civilizations that developed in the regions of the Mediterranean Sea, today's Europe and the Middle East, into the arena of the more fragmented civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa. Africa became a source of slaves for the cultures of the Mediterranean world many centuries before the discovery of the Americas, but it was that discovery and the resulting shift in focus towards the Atlantic that prompted the culminating explosive growth in slavery with such tragic effect. Slavery was, in fact, a central feature of life in the Mediterranean world, especially in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Greece, Imperial Rome, and the Islamic societies of the Middle East and North Africa. The most important source of slaves in medieval Europe, Clark's research shows, was the coast of Bosnia on the eastern shores of the Adriatic Sea. The word slave and its cognates in most modern European languages is itself derived from Sclavis's meaning Slav, the ethnic name for the inhabitants of this region. For various reasons, including the harshness of the terrain and endemic warfare among local clans, Bosnia proved the most convenient and long-lasting of these slave-supplying regions. Whichever clan gained a temporary upper hand was always willing to sell its captured rivals in exchange for the goods of the Mediterranean world in the markets of the ancient Romanized city of Ragusa, that is, present-day Dubrovnik. From there, Slavs were shipped as slaves by Venetian merchants to supply new markets in the Islamic world. Thus, for the Islamic world, Clark further reveals, Slavs provided the major source of slaves in the 250 or so years between the defeat at the Battle of Poitiers in AD 732 that forced the consolidation of their dramatic conquests across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, cutting back the flow of war captives, and the expansion of the import of black Africans across the Sahara from around AD 1000. The number of people enslaved by Muslims has been a hotly debated topic, especially when the millions of Africans forced from their homelands are considered. With full control of a great part of Africa, the Arabs began to capture young boys and girls and took them to Egypt, where they were sold into slavery within Africa, or taken across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia, China, Southwest Asia, and India. By the 10th century, the demand for slaves from Africa to work as plantation hands, sex slaves, domestic maids, and slave warriors had increased greatly, so much so that an estimated number of 5,000 slaves were shipped out of Africa a year. The historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that some 9.85 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia, and in small numbers to the Indian subcontinent. Lovejoy breaks his figures down as follows. Between AD 650 and 1600, an average of 5,000 Africans were shipped out per annum by the Arabs. This makes a rough total of 7.25 million. Then, between 1600 and 1800, another 1.4 million Africans were shipped out by the Arabs. The 19th century represented the highest point of the Arabian trade, as 12,000 Africans were vehemently shipped out per annum. The total figure for the 19th century alone was 1.2 million slaves to Arabia. Some other historians estimate altogether that between AD 650 and 1900, 10 million to 20 million people were enslaved by Arab slave traders. Others believe that over 20 million enslaved Africans alone had been delivered through the trans-Saharan route alone to the Islamic world. Dr. John Alambella Azuma estimates in his 2001 book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, that over 80 million more black people died over that route. The Arab slave trade was so intense, bloody, merciless to say the least. The cruelty on African captives by the Arabs was beyond telling. Similar to the transatlantic slave trade, captured slaves were beaten to be weakened and chained together. However, captured victims in the sub-Saharan slave trade had to endure several weeks of walking through the desert, carrying loads for their new masters from West or East Africa, to where they were eventually sold in the slave markets: Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other centers. These slaves played various roles in the economy of the Muslim world. They were used as servants, harem keepers, laborers in fields, mines, and hydraulic yards, and as cannon fodder in armies. In several of his detailed book about the slave trade, British explorer Henry Hamilton Johnston explains how several slaves died in the desert, while others who fell sick or were badly bruised and could not make it were brutally killed by their masters. David Livingstone, the British missionary, traveler, and explorer, was so upset by the way the Arabs treated their African slaves that he wrote back home in the year 1870. These were his words. In less than I take to talk about it, these unfortunate creatures, 84 of them, wended their way into the village where we were. Some of them, the eldest, were women from 20 to 22 years of age, and there were youths from 18 to 19 years. But the large majority was made up of boys and girls from 7 years to 14 or 15 years of age. A more terrible scene than these men, women, and children I do not think I ever came across. To say that they were emaciated would not give you an idea of what human beings can undergo under certain circumstances. Each of them had his neck in a large forked stick weighing from 30 to 40 pounds and 5 or 6 feet long, cut with a fork at the end of it where the branches of a tree spread out. The women were tethered with bark thongs, which are of all things the most cruel to be tied with. Of course, the bark thongs are soft and supple when first stripped off the trees, but a few hours in the sun would make them about as hard as the iron round packing cases. The little children were fastened by thongs to their mothers. As we passed along the path through which these slaves had traveled, I was shown a spot in the bushes where a poor woman the day before, unable to keep up with the march and most likely to hinder it, was cut down by the axe of one of these slave drivers. We went on further and were shown a place where a child lay. It had been recently born and its mother was unable to carry it from debility and exhaustion. So the slave trader had taken this little infant by its feet and dashed its brains out against one of the trees and thrown it in there. Such was the brutality meted out to the Africans by the Arabs. Looking at all this in a very factly honest manner, the totality of the unthinkable, horrid practices besetted upon a certain group of people. Historians agree that it is a mistake to equate the bare survival of Africa with cultural or social or economic stagnation, for the slave trade visited such panoply of tragically interconnected disasters into the lives of every African for centuries, so that they have worked their way into the very racial memory of the continent and its people, particularly females, that only with time and kindness can it be expunged from the psyche of Africa. The Arabs' treatment of black Africans can aptly be termed an African genocide. Arabs killed more Africans in transit, especially when crossing the Sahara Desert, than Europeans and Americans combined, and over more centuries, both before and after the years of the Atlantic slave trade. Arab Muslims began extracting millions of black African slaves centuries before Christian nations did. Arab slave traders removed slaves from Africa for about 13 centuries. compared to the 3 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. African slaves transported by Arabs across the Sahara Desert died more often than slaves making the middle passage to the New World by ship. Slaves invariably died within 5 years if they worked in the Ottoman Empire's Sahara salt mines. Black Africans did not enjoy immunity to many of the diseases found in the Arab world, which also resulted in high death rates. In West Africa, the Arab slave trade encompassed a vast region from the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea. This traffic followed the trans-Saharan roads. The crossing could last up to 3 months with a high mortality rate due to the dire conditions of the trip. Here is the testimony of the German explorer Gustav Nachtigall. The poor children of the black countries seemed to meet death here, at the last stage of a long, hopeless, and painful journey. The long journey accomplished with insufficient food and scarce water, the contrast between the rich natural resources and the humid atmosphere of their homeland, and the dry and anemic air of the desert, the fatigue and the privations imposed by their masters and by the circumstances in which they find themselves, all this has gradually ruined their young strengths. The memory of their homeland that has disappeared along the way, their fear of an unknown future, the endless journey under the blows, hunger, thirst, and deadly exhaustion have paralyzed their last faculties of resistance. If the poor creatures lack strength to get up and walk again, they are simply abandoned, and their minds slowly fade under the destructive effect of the rays of the sun, hunger, and thirst. According to the work of some historians, the Arab slave trade has affected more than 17 million people. In the Saharan region alone, more than 9 million African captives were deported and 2 million died on the roads. This despicable phenomenon was legitimized by Islam, as Christianity would later condone the transatlantic slave trade. For example, the Tunisian Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, from 1332 to 1406, wrote that the only peoples to accept slavery are the Negroes because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage. Another one, the Algerian Arab theologian Ahmed al-Wancharisi, from 1430/1431 to 1508, offered legal and religious recommendations. This, he said, "I have been asked about slaves from the land of Abyssinia who profess monotheism and accept the rules of the Holy Law. Is it legal or not to buy and sell them? If their conversion to Islam comes after the establishment of a property right on these slaves, then Islam does not demand liberation because slavery was caused by unbelief. The state of servitude persists after the disappearance of unbelief because of its existence in the past." The Arab slave trade was characterized by appalling violence, rape, and worst of all, castration of black male slaves. While African women and girls were targeted, captured, and deported by Arab slavers for use as sex slaves, the male captives were, on the other hand, pitilessly castrated to prevent them from reproducing and becoming a stock. Castration of male slaves became a habit among slave traders due to the fact that they were in higher demand, stronger, noted to work faster and more efficiently, and were not a threat to slave masters and owners who feared that their wives, concubines, and female slaves would have affairs with them. The suffering inflicted on the victims of castration was profound, encompassing physical and psychological trauma. Castration was done to boys between the ages of 9 and 12, as it was believed that they survived the process more than an adult or adolescent. Although very many did not survive the process, as they often died during or after the harrowing operation. Whites died more, so slavers concentrated more on blacks. This was the darkest chapter in history that highlights the extent to which humans were dehumanized and exploited for gain. Here's a more detailed insight into this practice. 1. Economic factors. One of the primary reasons for castrating male captives was economic. The exporting countries had good economic incentives to castrate male slaves before they were shipped off. In the medieval slaving industry that was designed for exporting Slavic prisoners of war to the Arab world, castrate Castrating the slaves was an integral part of the process. Castration was then performed in the famous castration houses in Venice. Eunuchs, or castrated male slaves, were highly sought after due to their perceived trustworthiness and reliability. Eunuchs were considered valuable commodities in Arab societies, thus fetching much higher prices in slave markets compared to non-castrated slaves. Their lack of reproductive capability meant that they could serve in positions of trust and authority without posing a threat to the owner's hereditary wealth and power. Eunuchs were often employed in sensitive positions such as harem guards, administrative posts, and as servants in elite households. They served in influential positions in the Abbasid Caliphate's administration, with some even rising to the rank of vizier. The economic incentives gained by slave traders from exporting black eunuchs to the Arab nations encouraged the practice of castration. In some cases, such as the Zanj Rebellion in the 9th century Iraq, castrated slaves were sought after to work in dangerous and demanding environments like salt mines. This practice had persisted for centuries in the Arab slave trade. As late as 1903, there were still 194 African eunuchs in service to the Ottoman ruling family. 2. Control and domination. Castration was employed by Arab slavers as a means of exerting control and dominance over their male captives. By removing their ability to procreate, the slavers aimed to eliminate any potential threats of rebellion or the establishment of rival lineages. Additionally, castration was intended to ensure that these slaves would remain solely devoted to their master's demands without the distractions of family or personal attachments. 3. Social dislocation. Enslaved males who were castrated were forcibly removed from their communities and families. This social dislocation had far-reaching consequences as it disrupted the social fabric of African societies and led to imbalanced gender ratios. In regions where castration was prevalent, such as East Africa and the Sudan, entire villages were affected as young men were captured and subjected to this brutal practice. Many eunuchs who served in the harem of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul remained in servitude for life, isolated from their African roots. Their roles as loyal servants or guards sometimes meant they were isolated from their own cultural backgrounds and communities for life. Young boys were captured and castrated so that when they grew up, they could serve as eunuchs in harems. This slave ship was photographed in 1896. This large group of young boys may have been destined for castration to serve as eunuchs. The slaves in the photograph were headed to a Muslim country well after the American Civil War. In fact, slavery in the United States was a good bit more humane than slavery in the Arab world. It was bloody for Africans, bloody beyond words. In some cases, African societies would engage in castration as a preemptive measure to protect their youth from being captured and castrated by Arab slave traders. This reflects the deep fear and trauma associated with this practice. 4. Psychological and physical trauma. Castration was itself a traumatic experience, both physically and psychologically, for those subjected to it. The surgery itself was often performed without anesthesia under crude and unhygienic conditions, leading to excruciating pain and a high risk of infection. Many African boys did not survive their castration surgery. 6 out of every 10 people who were mutilated died from their wounds in castration centers. This is a prime reason why there are not many communities of blacks living in the non-African Muslim world today, despite the millions of black African slaves who were sold into the Muslim world. Castration led to hormonal imbalances on survivors, affecting the physical development and health of victims. Without testosterone, eunuchs often suffered from various health issues such as decreased muscle mass, fatigue, obesity, osteoporosis, and a lack of secondary sexual characteristics. 5. Cultural and religious beliefs. Some societies believed that castrated individuals were spiritually purer and more suitable for certain religious duties. For instance, in some Islamic societies, eunuchs were considered more appropriate for guarding holy sites. The guardianship of the Holy Kaaba in Mecca included the use of African eunuchs. Some men were castrated to be eunuchs in domestic service, and the practice of neutering male slaves was not limited to only black males. The Khalifa in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century had 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs in his palace, writes author Ronald Siegel in his 2002 book, Islam's Black Slaves, The Other Black Diaspora. In the Arab world, demand for castrated slaves was so high that even with the appalling death rate from the procedure, it was still profitable, which explains why there is no large African diaspora community in Arab countries. Castrated men don't father children. The Arab slave trade had a tragic impact on the evolution of African societies. Some areas were completely devastated and depopulated. Welsh explorer Henry Morton Stanley, from 1841 to 1904, was a horrified witness of this traffic. He wrote that after the depredations of the Arab traffickers, the black blood flows toward the north, the equator smells corpses. As one commentator puts it, could it be true that the corrosive effects of 4 centuries of commerce in humans, with its temptation, its inbuilt opportunism, its reduction of humans to a cash value, its cycles of revenge, and its inevitable physical brutality, have built lasting flaws into the African pattern of thought and action? The United Nations has made March 23 the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and UNESCO has made August 23 the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. When will there be an International Day to commemorate the victims of the Arab-Muslim slave trade? When will an international research program address this subject? When will a project be implemented to identify, restore, and publicize the sites and monuments linked to this Arab trade, like the existing projects concerning the transatlantic trade? When will educational material be produced and cultural and artistic programs conducted to raise awareness of this criminal activity? When will a museum on the Arab-Muslim slave trade be established? This brings us to the end of this video segment. And did you happen to learn a thing or two? If so, then don't forget to like the video, share with your families and friends, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to Flatiron School. This is where you learn how the future works, where the whole point of education.
Although the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa imported more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than did the European offshoot nations of the Western Hemisphere, there are in these Muslim countries today no such large, discrete, and self-conscious groups of black African descent as the 60 million Negroes currently living in the Western Hemisphere. Among the reasons for this anomaly were the higher mortality rates of slaves in transit to North Africa and the Middle East, their greater vulnerability to the diseases of that region, and a very low rate of reproduction. Because the slaves were brought from long distances, often from isolated villages, they might lack biological resistance to the diseases encountered along the overland slave trade routes or at their final destinations. Although manumission was widespread in Islamic lands, the beneficiaries of this were often military slaves and others in higher occupations, where the slaves were most apt to be white rather than black. In general, black slaves were used in more menial and laborious tasks, and it was these slaves who were most likely to live and die as slaves, with their children being born into slavery. They had few children, however, for both marriage and casual sex among slaves was suppressed. Moreover, the death rate among those few children was so high that they rarely lived to adulthood. The widespread use of eunuchs in the harems of the Islamic countries further reduced the ability of the African slave population to reproduce itself. In the 10th century, the court of the Caliph of Baghdad reportedly included 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. With the passing centuries, as European nations grew militarily stronger and became better able to resist the Islamic nations, European slaves became scarcer in the Islamic lands to which they had once been sent in great numbers. Their importation was drastically reduced in the early decades of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia conquered the Caucasus, from which European slaves were being shipped to the Ottoman Empire. However, as late as the 1850s, orders against the traffic in white slaves from Russian-controlled Georgia and Circassia were being issued by the Ottoman government. By the end of the 19th century, white slaves had virtually disappeared, except in Arabia, while black slavery was not abolished in most Islamic countries until the period between the two world wars of the 20th century, and still existed in Mauritania and the Sudan at the end of the 20th century. The horrors of the Atlantic voyage in packed and suffocating slave ships, together with exposure to new diseases from Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of all slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels in the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara, was twice as high. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting the last desperate efforts to reach water. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans, often because their feet had swollen from walking across the hot sands, were abandoned in the desert to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. In 1849, a letter from an Ottoman official referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. On another route, it was said that someone unfamiliar with the desert might almost be able to find his way just by following the trail of skeletons of people and camels. Widespread loss of life began with the initial slave raids. As late as 1886, 1946, an Austrian who was an apologist for slavery nevertheless reported, "Negro villages are burned, all the men killed, and their women and children are taken on months-long, terrible marches." The march from slave-gathering areas, like the region around Lake Chad, across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean Sea, took about 3 months, and often only the strongest survived. Other slave routes to Islamic countries were over water, but this meant risking interception by the British Navy, and that in turn often meant that slaves were thrown overboard to drown, rather than being allowed to remain on board to be discovered as incriminating evidence. The trans-Saharan caravan route was the most deadly, however. It has been estimated that for every slave to reach Cairo alive, 10 died on the way. Nor was Cairo exceptional. Missionary explorer David Livingstone, among others, estimated that several slaves were captured for every one that reached the Mediterranean alive. Women were particularly vulnerable and were more in demand than men. They brought higher prices in the Islamic countries as servants or as concubines. Ethiopian women sold for higher prices than Negro women, and white women from the Caucasus brought the highest prices of all. A special danger to men and boys was castration, to produce the eunuchs widely used in Islamic countries for work in the harems. Because the operation was forbidden under Islamic law, it was usually performed early and often crudely, before reaching areas under the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. An estimated 90% of the men or boys died from the operation, though some groups are skilled to have much lower motives. Dead and dying slaves were a common sight in the wake of a slave caravan. David Livingstone said that the common incidents of the slave trade that he had seen were so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. For example, one woman who was unable to carry both her load and young child and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. It was not only the Christian missionary Livingstone who was shocked by the brutality of Arab slave raiders and traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military. The prime destination of the African slave trade to the Islamic world was Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the largest and busiest slave market flourished. There, women were paraded, examined, questioned, and bid on in a public display, often witnessed by visiting foreigners, until it was finally closed down in 1847 and the slave trade in Istanbul moved underground. In other Islamic countries, however, the slave markets remained open and public, both to natives and foreigners. In 1868, a British captain witnessed the scene at a slave market in Zanzibar. Rows of girls from the age of 12 and upwards are exposed to the examination of throngs of Arab slave dealers and subjected to inexpressible indignities by the brutal dealers. This market functioned until 1873, when 2 British cruisers appeared offshore, followed by an ultimatum from Britain that the Zanzibar slave trade must cease or the island would face a... This was part of a wider crackdown on the seaborne slave trade in 1873, which caused the trade to become localized rather than to disappear entirely. The treatment of slaves in transit by slave traders often
This supposedly greatest man who ever lived, mercy for all mankind, the whole universe was made for him. Jeez, I mean, I made a little video on Idi Amin, who gave himself all these self-congratulating titles, you know, Lord of the Fishes and all the beasts of the world, the conqueror of the British Empire, the greatest man who ever lived, blah blah blah. Those are the self-congratulating titles Idi Amin gave to himself. So Muhammad also gave himself all this credit. You know, like the universe was made for him. He's a mercy for not just this planet, but the entire world. Kind of like Idi Amin said, he's a lord of the fishes in the seas and all the animals, all the beasts on land. So at least he confined it to this planet. But Prophet Muhammad, next level narcissism. Prophet Muhammad took it to, oh, not mercy for this world, but all the worlds. So that's Prophet Muhammad. So let's have a look. What was the character of this merciful man? So once this guy asked him, the Prophet was asked that children are killed. So this guy is concerned. He has better morality. He's like, okay, Prophet, you know, like when we raid and we kill these infidels, the polytheists, fair enough, they are enemy combatants, so we're killing them. But what about their women and children? Isn't that bad? That actually, I think, is a very good indication. And there's another one too, I'll tell you later, later in the story. That shows that those people who had adopted Islam, they had better morality. They were concerned. There are numerous times we've seen that people ask Muhammad that, isn't this wrong? And now in this day and age, we can tell, yes, it's definitely wrong. Muhammad is like, yeah, this is collateral damage. Yeah, whatever. They are from among them. Don't worry about them. It's okay. So that's why, how can Muslims today cry about collateral damage? Oh, look, United States, to kill one terrorist, they killed the entire family, which I agree. Collateral damage in an ideal world should never happen. And government should be very, very careful. And we've seen in those WikiLeaks videos that sometimes they're not really that careful. They just press the button. For them, it's just a drone footage. Just press the button. There are 10 people dead. Who cares? So we know that that can happen, and we obviously can't support that. But we are logically consistent. We would say that don't do that to anyone. But these guys, look what your prophet is saying. Your prophet is saying, well, doesn't matter, their children and their wives, their women and children. Kill them, doesn't matter, don't worry about it. That's the mercy for all mankind is saying. And that's just his general saying, but look how he applied that in practice. Those of you who don't know, I've said this story before. Nadir ibn Harith used to say that Prophet Muhammad tells stories that we've already heard, and I can tell these stories better than Muhammad. Muhammad said, how dare we kill him? He was killed. So there was another guy called Abu Afaq, and he was quite disheartened at this blatant murder of this poet, Nadir ibn Harith, just over a petty disagreement. So he wrote a poem. Look what he said. He said, long have I lived, but never have I seen an assembly or collection of people more faithful to their undertaking and their allies when called upon than sons of Kayla when they assembled, men who overthrew mountains and never submitted. A rider who came to them split them in two. So he first started talking about the people, how brave and wonderful these people are in Arabia. But then a rider who came to them split them in two, permitted, forbidden, of all sort of things. So this guy came who divided them and said, okay, this is permitted, this is not permitted. Came up with his own moral code, which is talking about Muhammad. Had you believed in glory or kingship, you would have followed Tuba. So Tuba is some other guy who's a critic of Muhammad. So he's saying you should have followed him instead of Muhammad. So pretty harmless, isn't it? That's a very gentle, diplomatic criticism of Muhammad. He's just saying that this guy just came and just divided your people, said this is right, this is wrong, and you shouldn't believe him. You should have followed this guy Tuba. Or Tuba's teaching. Guess what the mercy for all mankind said? The apostle said, who will deal with this rascal for me? Whereupon this guy, Salim, these blind followers of Muhammad, Auf, one of the weepers, went forth and killed him. Just go and kill him, like he just said it. Just kill him. Just imagine this. It's like, if we had this moral guide today, there would be no opposition leaders. Everyone, kill him. That's how brutal Muhammad was. So anyway, so another woman came to surface. Her name was Asma bint Marwa. Now she was disgruntled at this blatant killing of Abu Afaq. She says, I despise bin Malik and al-Nabid, and Nadir ibn Harith and now Abu Afaq. So she's saying that she despises them. So she gets a little bit more harsher, but so I think Muslims it would be easier for Muslims to defend this murder, but not the previous two. So because she, after these two murders of the famous poets, She says, you obey a stranger who is none of yours, one not of Murad or Mataji. Do you, so these are two different tribes. She's saying she doesn't even belong to any of these two tribes, so why do you listen to him? Do you expect good from him after the killing of your chiefs, like a hungry man waiting for a cook's broth? Is there no man of pride who would attack him by surprise and cut off the hopes of those who expect aught from him? So, okay, so she's saying, just take care of him. And she's now saying it after the murder of two guys, two of her guys. And some people would say, well, she's inciting to violence as well. Okay, after your prophet has murdered so many people. Anyway, so Prophet Muhammad again said, when the apostle heard what she had said, he said, who will rid me of Marwan's daughter? How dare she speak ill of me? So another brain-dead zombie got up. Umair, who was with him, heard him and who was with him heard him, and that very night he went to her house and killed her. Now in the morning he came to the apostle and told him what he had done, and he said, you have helped God and his apostle, O Umair. Obviously now he's going to say, oh, you have wonderful job, wonderful, you've killed a helpless woman who used to criticize me. Well done, son. You have helped Allah. That's what Muhammad said. Allah, you have helped Allah. The creator of billions of galaxies could not strike her down with a bolt of lightning, but got him assassinated by this brain-dead zombie. So, but again, see how I told you that this other guy also asked, narrated by Ibn Abbas, that Prophet was asked what to do with women and children, and Prophet Muhammad said, yeah, just doesn't matter, do them. Meaning that the person who's asking Muhammad is thinking, that's a bit wrong. Same guy, Umair, a different guy, Umair, also asked the same question after he had blindly taken Muhammad's order and murdered this helpless woman. He said to Muhammad, he asked Muhammad, when he asked if he would have to bear any evil consequences of murdering a woman, the apostle said, 2 goats won't butt their heads about her. See, even this guy Umair, even after he's murdered her in his blind obedience to Muhammad, even he's thinking that, are there going to be any evil consequences? Because after all, I murdered. And there are other stories, it says that she actually had a child on her, and he removed the child and then stabbed her. It was said as though, like he did a favor, he didn't kill the baby, because he could have killed the baby as well. So that's the other, some other stories write that story down like that. So these people had better morality than Muhammad. That tells me better morality of the time. They are concerned about killing women and children. But Muhammad is like, they are one of them. They are infidels. Go kill them. So how do these people complain about collateral damage now when the shoe is in the other foot? So when they say, when these terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, when they hide in schools and hospitals, Israel doesn't care, and sometimes they bomb them, and I condemn that, and they kill women and children, and then they show the videos. They're like, oh, look, Israel have killed our women and children. Why, first of all, what are you doing hiding in schools and hospitals? Why are you using humans as human shield? And secondly, your own prophet supported that. Your prophet said they're one of them. Who cares? Just kill them. So that's just hypocrisy, and these people just don't know their own religion. So anyway, that's the character of Prophet Muhammad. To help me produce more videos like these, support me on Patreon or PayPal.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon is not with physical products. It's Amazon's other company, Audible.
That's why a lot of people are saying this is the age of awakening. We will ban Islam and Christianity in this country.
You said you were a Muslim.
Yes.
We should ban your own people.
Speaking the truth against your own religion has nothing to do with atheism or evil. These Arabians were those who enslaved our forefathers. They even castrated them.
Like he said, it's the age of awakening. So much is going on the continent, so much is going on TikTok. We are seeing a lot of pushback when it comes to these Abrahamic religions. So I did a video some months back talking about specifically Christianity and how African are moving away from it, but right now we're going to be talking about Islam and how the exact same thing is happening. We're seeing people coming out talking about how they are living the faith. Slowly, Africans are beginning to awaken to new realizations. They are deconstructing and decolonizing their minds, and the scales that have been covering their eyes are falling off, so now they now see things differently. We are seeing a call for cultural revolution. It's as if someone somewhere just snapped their fingers and now people are waking up left, right, center. Africans are now coming to a new realization of who they are, and they are not keeping quiet about it. They are fearlessly questioning everything and critically looking into their history, and now coming into the realization that these religions played a major role in their history as they were used as a tool to colonize, enslave, subjugate, and subdue the African people. Now, this brother on the screen is a Ghanaian, and he was once a Muslim. He said a lot of interesting things in this video. Let's roll the clip. I'll meet you guys at the end.
So that Jesus story was copied from Egypt.
So Jesus, what was Jesus?
Jesus, there was nobody called Jesus. They said Abdul Latif, but can call me Nana Prod. Yes, we were born into Islam, so we're given these names. They said we are God's children, we fear God the most, so they should pass through religion and tell us that Allah abhors spirituality, so we shouldn't delve into spirituality as Muslims. Then through Christianity, they told our Christian brothers and sisters that our idols are blasphemous, so she threw them away.